Today I'm going to be presenting to you my thesis entitled Evaluating the Validity of the PEAK-T Assessment and the Efficacy of the PEAK-T Curriculum. Applied behavior analysis is the scientific approach to understanding and improving socially significant behaviors, as well as reducing maladaptive behaviors. The field of ABA, or Applied Behavior Analysis, has some defining dimensions as set forth by Baer, Wilf, and Risley. These dimensions are applied, behavioral, analytical, technological, conceptually systematic, effective, and generality. As a way to understand language, the science of behavior analysis has relied for many years on Skinner's account of language as described in his 1957 book, Analysis of Verbal Behavior. In his book, Skinner defines verbal behavior as the behavior of a speaker, which is reinforced through the mediation of a listener who has been trained to do so by the verbal community. Skinner describes 6 elementary verbal operants, which are mands, tax, echoics, interverbals, textual, and transcription. Stimulus equivalence is the emergence of the correct responding of untrained stimuli that have not been previously reinforced, following the reinforcement of correct responding of other stimulus-stimulus relations. 3 behavioral elements: symmetry, reflexivity, and transitivity. Relational frame theory is a behavioral account of human language and cognition as proposed by Hayes, Barnes-Holmes, and Roche. There are 2 types of relational responses: non-arbitrary and arbitrarily applicable. Relational frame theory states that relating is a generalized operant, and in the event that an individual is exposed and taught significant exemplars of relational responding, they will ultimately be able to relate any stimulus to another without direct training and in novel contexts. Researchers in RFT were able to identify specific patterns of relational responding known as relational frames. Relational frames consist of mutual entailment, combinatorial entailment, and transformation of stimulus function. According to RFT, there are several categories or families of relational frames. The ones most often discussed are frames of coordination, opposition, distinction, comparison, hierarchical frames, temporal relations, spatial relations, causality, and deictic frames. Based on the research and theory of stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory, Dixon developed Promoting the Emergence of Advanced Knowledge, or PEAK. It's an assessment and curriculum protocol designed for implementation by therapists, parents, caregivers, and teachers. The PEAK protocol consists of 4 modules: direct training, or PEAK-DT, generalization, or PEAK-G, equivalence, or PEAK-E, and transformation, PEAK-T. For the purpose of this study was to extend on the already existing body of research that supports PEAK assessment and curriculum. This study will extend on previous studies that have found PEAK assessments to be a valid and effective tool at determining the level of functioning, pinpointing areas of deficit, determining applicable programs, and that address those specific deficits. Additionally, this study will extend and further support the already extensive research conducted on the efficacy of the PEAK curriculum at teaching new and complex skill. Additionally, the current study will provide support to the notion generated by RFT that relating is a generalized operant. The participants of this study were 3 boys diagnosed with autism: John, Robbie, and Bran. The sessions took place at the University Autism Clinic during their scheduled session times. The materials used in this study were the PEAK-T pre-assessment, the PEAK-T assessment, full assessment, the specific stimuli required for each T program, and items identified previously as reinforcers. The measurements and reliability. The dependent variable in this study was the percent correct responding for each of the participant on their designated PEAK program. Inter-observer agreement was collected for 33% of the sessions, and it was determined to be 100%. The design in this study was a multiple baseline across PEAK programs for each of the participants. The programs selected for each of the participants are as following: for John, 3A, comparison bigger and smaller; 3B, comparison faster and slower; and 4H, hierarchical sorting objects by features. And for Robbie, 3B, comparison faster and slower; 3C, opposition, faster and slower, and 3D, picture discrimination. And for Brandon, 3C, opposition, faster and slower, 3D, distinction, picture discrimination, and 4A, distinction, textual discrimination. The pre-assessment scores for each of the participants are displayed in the table below. They depict each of the participants' scores and each of the frames, as well as the total for the pre-assessment. The results of the full assessment for each of the participants are demonstrated in the graph below. The bar graph illustrates the score for each of the participants was able to achieve before and after training in the PEAK-T programs on the full assessment. Before training, John was able to achieve a score of 8, and after it was a score of 12. For Robbie, he achieved pre-test a score of 5 and post-test a score of 8. And for Bran, he was able to achieve a score of 4 pre-test and 9 post-test. This graph is a visual representation of John's performance across 3 PEAK programs. The x-axis is the number of trial blocks, and the y-axis is the percent correct responding. For the first program, 3A, comparison bigger and smaller, the training trial blocks are represented by a filled-in square, while the test trials are represented by an open square. For this program, John consistently achieved 20% correct responding during baseline, and responding during training or after training was implemented jumped to about 60% correct responding. There was an increase from there on, and he was able to achieve mastery criterion after 8 trial blocks, and with 100% correct responding on the transformation task. The next program depicted on this graph is 3C, opposition, faster and slower. On this graph, the trained trial blocks are represented with the filled-in circles, while the test trial blocks are represented with the open circles. During baseline, his performance ranged between 0 and 20% correct responding. And after implementation of training, there was a gradual increase in percent correct. And the last 3 trial blocks, he scored 100% correct responding, and he was able to achieve mastery criterion after 12 trial blocks. And the last one is the PEAK-T program 4C, hierarchical sorting objects by feature. During baseline, he was consistently getting 0% correct responding on test and trial blocks. In this graph, the trained trial blocks were represented by the filled-in rectangles, and the tests were represented by the open triangles. After implementation of training, there was a gradual increase in correct responding, and stability was observed during the last 3 trial blocks with a score between 80 and 100% correct responding. He was also able to achieve mastery criterion within 8 trial blocks with a mean score of 90 correct responding on the transformation task. This graph is a visual representation of Robbie's performance across 3 PEAK-T programs. Again, on the x-axis, we have the number of trial blocks, and on the y-axis, we have the percent correct responding. For the first program, 3A, comparison bigger and smaller, during the training trials are represented by the filled-in diamond, and the test trials are represented by the open diamonds. During baseline performance, he was consistently scoring a 0 correct responding across all trial blocks. After the implementation of training, there is a dramatic increase of correct responding within 1 trial block to 80% correct responding. Performance remained high and stable, with percent correct responding ranging between 80 and 100%. Mastery criterion was met after 12 trial blocks with a mean score of 100% correct responding on the transformation task. The next program was 3B, comparison faster and slower. Here the training trials are represented with a filled-in circle, and the test trials are represented with the open circle. During baseline, performance was variable, ranging between 0 and 40% correct responding. However, responding did stabilize at 0% correct responding. There was also variability after implementation of training. However, there was a gradual and stable pattern of performance after the 9th trial block. Performance then ranged between 60 and 100% correct responding. Mastery criterion was reached after 20 trial blocks with a mean score of 100% correct responding on the transformation task. For the last program, 3D, distinction, picture discrimination, the training trial blocks are represented with the closed, filled-in square, while the test trial blocks were represented with the open square. During baseline, responding ranged between 0 to 40 correct responding, and a stable pattern of responding was observed after the 3rd trial block. With training, there was a substantial increase in percent responding, and performance ranged between 80 and 100% before mastery criterion was achieved. He was able to achieve mastery after 12 trial blocks, with 100% correct responding on the transformation task. This graph is a visual representation of Brandt's performance across 3 PEAK-T programs. Here, the x-axis is the number of trial blocks, and the y-axis is the percent correct responding. For the first program, 3C, opposition, faster and slower, the training trial blocks are represented by the filled-in squares, and the test trial blocks are represented by the open squares. During baseline, performance ranged between 0 and 20% correct responding. After training was implemented, performance increased, and it was gradual increase in correct responding. Performance did stabilize at the last 3 trial blocks, yielding between 80 and 100% correct responding. Mastery criterion was met after 16 trial blocks, and the mean performance on the transformation task was between 80 and 100% correct responding. The next program is 3D, distinction, picture discrimination. Here, training trial blocks are represented by the closed-in diamond, and the test trial block are represented by the open diamonds. During baseline, he consistently got 0% correct responding on both the test and the training trial blocks. After the implementation of training, there was a dramatic increase in the correct responding, and he was quickly able to achieve mastery criterion, and it was met after 12 trial blocks. The mean performance on the transformation task was 87% correct responding. The last program was the 4A distinction, textual discrimination. Here, the training trials are represented by the filled-in rectangle or triangle, and the test trials are represented by the open triangles. Here, during baseline, his performance was between 0 and 20% correct responding. He only got 20% correct responding on the first trial block, and then it was consistently 0% correct responding. After the implementation of training, he was able to increase the percent correct responding on the training trial blocks, whereas the test trial blocks remained at 0% correct responding. However, after the 7th trial block, the participant began to show the emergence of the skill, with performance ranging between 80 and 100% correct responding on the test trial block. Mastery criterion was met after 28 trial blocks, with a mean of 100% correct responding on the transformation task. Based on the results of this study, the PEAK-T assessment was determined to be a valid tool at assessing the functioning level of each of the participants, as well as identifying deficits within each of their repertoires. Additionally, the PEAK-T curriculum was determined to be an effective tool at teaching participants new and complex skills. However, there were some limitations to the studies, including the limited sample size. We only had 3 participants, which made it hard to make generalizations to other populations. Additionally, they had continued exposure to PEAK throughout the entire study outside of the context of the study. Also, Brand showed a lack of generalization of skill across the same frame of distinction. Future research could conduct studies with a larger sample size, as well as studying the generalization of skills within and across relational frame, and evaluate the number of exemplars needed in order to effectively establish a relational responding as a generalized operant.